Our next speaker, Alexie Torres-Fleming. She's Executive Director of the Access Strategies Fund. Alexie is an activist, community organizer, public speaker, and urban planner from the South Bronx, New York, with over 25 years of experience in social justice leadership in low-income communities of color. Alexie came to Massachusetts in 2014 as a Harvard University Loeb Fellow, where she explored how community organizing can inform urban planning strategies. Alexie Torres-Fleming will speak to us about uncovering the soul of the movement. Alexie.
Thank you, Callie. And thank you, Steve, for that wonderful presentation and for teeing up for me what I think is a consistent theme, which is how we might be able to dig a little deeper than the surface sort of head understanding about issues going on in our world, mental health in the case of Steve, and in my case, in the case of social movement, how we might be able to dig a little bit deeper and understand them from a different place, perhaps from a place of the heart or a place of the soul. We understand these times as frightening times in our country. It feels, these are just some images that help us understand and that we see on a regular basis, and that begin to feel like the xenophobia and racism and hatred and misogyny has been unleashed anew in our country. We see so many people taking to the streets, and we wonder at what seems to be this unraveling of what we understood our life before our eyes. We blame politicians, we blame corporations, and deep inside we understand that this is pointing to a deep sense of somehow our loss of our moral compass and a deep sense of a loss of the soul of our country. It is for me and for many of us a time of awakening and a time of understanding the soul that wakens us and moves us towards social change. So this feeling right now is familiar to me. I was born and raised in the 1960s and 70s in the South Bronx, New York. So these are images of my community when I was growing up. And I grew up during very dark and tumultuous times in the South Bronx. Many of you know it historically as the time of the burning of the Bronx or planned shrinkage. I understood it as a little girl perched on the 9th floor radiator looking out the window from my public housing projects and wondering how on earth I could survive what appeared to be this total unraveling of my life and my community. I lived and grew up during some difficult times of violence, of unemployment, of a lot of fear in the neighborhood that I grew up in. And I was taught that there could be a few responses, right? Society taught me as a brown girl who grew up poor and who grew up in a household where my family had emigrated from Puerto Rico, so first generation born in this country, that I only had a few options, right? So one of them for me was, and for my family, was turning to our faith. And church became a really important part of this journey for us. But what I found at church was this sense of dissatisfaction, the sense that I was being told, on the one hand, that I could come to this sanctuary and hide and feel safe, right? Maybe get my golden ticket into heaven or the next life or wherever I was going. But I wondered as a child often if the God in here understood the hell that was breaking loose out there, and if somehow there could be some sort of connection between these two worlds for me. The world of my faith, the deep well of spirit that I was born into and taught, and the world of what was unraveling outside of me. So that didn't seem like the place where I could find that answer. And then society also, and when I say that broadly, I mean school, I mean the media, I mean business. All around me were other messages, and these were the messages. You are the at-risk kid, right? You are the list of all of, this is how the world defined me, right? And how it defines so many young people in urban centers that we see today on television, in all of the movements that are arising across this country and across the globe. At risk, potential dropout, at risk of violence, at risk of pregnancy, at risk of taking drugs, at risk of running away, at risk of being sexually trafficked. And I began to understand that the world saw me and understood me only by this list of things that it might be able to prevent me from doing. So I felt like a bit of a case study, right? I felt like a bit of a social experiment. And so the underlying message behind all of that was that the measure of my success would actually not be being able to stay and figure out how to live and rebuild and support my community, but that the measure of my success as a poor brown girl would be how far I could escape from this place. In so many ways, tearing at me because it was contrary to the other message that I had, which is that my community was grounded in family, in love, in belonging, and in caring for one another. But this was the journey that I took. I left home and went into corporate America, and by all standards sort of had become this success story for the world, right? I was the brown girl that had made it out of the ghetto and was making money and was working, on Wall Street in corporate America and later on Madison Avenue. I worked for David Rockefeller for a while. The paradox of living amongst the poorest of the poor and then working for one of the wealthiest people in the world was not lost on me. And so it was in this time where I began to really feel my soul stirring, because what happened? What happened was that my individual success in that world did absolutely nothing for my community back home. If anything, it continued to unravel. After I left the South Bronx, the crack epidemic continued to unravel and tear apart my community. And so if the message that we're giving young people is to get up and out, is to escape, is to make a better life, it's the Americanized, right, individual, pull yourself up by your bootstraps message, and we never teach how to belong, how to connect, then we miss the powerful soul that is what creates and fuels and feeds social movements in this country. And so I began to question and seek for that. And lo and behold, I received an invitation to go back to, of all places, church. And I received this, I was already living in Midtown Manhattan. I received this invitation to come back home because my local church was organizing against around crack houses that had popped up in the neighborhood. And I showed up to a meeting, and I had this experience where I was like, wait, I learned all about this in this head, right? So in my head, I had heard about, Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, but and then I understood my faith, but I never understood how the two might be able to be bridged. I thought that I had to live those two separately. But in this experience, I heard people of faith, people of spirit talking about this idea that we belong to one another. And that our community is actually where sacredness lies. And if you will, where the real presence of what is holy exists. It doesn't exist in buildings, right? It didn't exist in the mouths or the minds of the people that were sort of, pasturing, but that actually what was sacred was what was outside. And that we had to care about that as much as what we cared about on the inside. While we were at church. And so that was fascinating to me. And it opened up a world of possibilities to me. And so I began to organize with this church. And, it's a long story, but the long and the short of it is that our organizing against crack houses in the neighborhood led to retaliation by local drug dealers in 1992 and the torching of our church. Horrible, frightening moment. I had left this, right? I had left the fires of the South Bronx only to come back into this place. And when I experienced that, when we saw that, and we decided to continue and to march on despite the fact that there were death threats and despite the fact that there were folks that said that the crowd would be shot into if we dared to continue this movement and this march, what I found was the deep beauty and the soul of a movement of people that I had been taught in my powerful world in corporate America to dismiss, who were powerless and that I should essentially just leave behind and forget. And so I spent that day after that, another beautiful march and many marches after that, really thinking a lot about what it is that compels us to create the conditions where in our communities, where we understand this fundamental idea that, scholars and activists and theologians and people of faith and spirit have spoken about for generations, and that is this idea of this web of life. The idea that when someone in my community, someone in my home, someone that we see in Ferguson or in Florida or anywhere across this country suffers and is diminished, then we are all diminished. And that, for me, is a deeply sacred principle of the movement and a deeply important part of what we must nurture in this moment of our country's history. After this, for 20 years, I engaged in this work as a faith-rooted activist, as an activist engaging communities of faith, both in practice and in principle, around this idea. And King spoke about it, right? He spoke about this idea that we can ultimately not legislate only dignity and our humanity, right? That we have to somehow reach behind the veil and understand that those things belong to an order that were intended by something greater than us. And that it is that, not just fight, not just anger, but real love is what will fuel the work of the movement moving forward. And yet we tend to hurt the soul of the movement in many ways in this country. And as a woman who now walks as an activist within the realm of philanthropy, I will share with you one of the ways that I think we really, really hurt the soul of the movement in this country now, and that is in the non-profitization of movement work. And you see that so much now, whether it was in the Occupy movement or the Black Lives Matter movement, you will hear the pushback and the concern around trying to create some sort of corporate structure of leadership and hierarchy in these types of movements. And some will mistake that and say that they're disorganized and they're not leaders. But I think what they're speaking to us is really, really important in this moment for our country and in this moment in how we determine how we support these movements moving forward. The non-profitization of movement is unique to our country. It's something, movements are forced to sort of organize themselves under 501c3 codes that essentially are part of this capitalist structure being imposed on work that is extremely sacred. And so what happens is that movements can choke on this. And this is what I found here in supporting and funding movements here across the state of Massachusetts. This deep concern and this deep fear of not being able to really fully do the things that communities need to do in order to really feed this soul and feed the sacred work that they're doing in movement. And so what are some of those things that folks need? Well, ritual. Simple things like being able to engage in community practice. I've been to organizations where you walk in and there's an altar that's set up, intentions, images of people that have passed in their community, images of the reasons why that indicate the reasons why from a heart place that folks want to connect to movement. And I feel that within the realm of philanthropy and within the realm of this work, we really need to begin to allow folks to engage from a soul place, and community organizations and movement organizations to continue to move from this place. Some of the ways that we see movement and the soul of movement continue to emerge is, and I invite you, pay attention to the music that's coming out in this particular moment of our country's history. Pay attention to the art that's coming out. All of these speak to the spirit and the soul of what is arising in our country and our people. And if we try simply to encapsulate it and capture it in policy, in legislation, and in our nonprofits, we will lose something very, very important and something very sacred at this moment. And so, sorry, I wasn't good with my slides. But I want to just close with this story, about what to me sort of speaks to this. These are some images of my father, and I lost my dad 2 years ago, but before that, Dad was a person who was very, very involved in the movement work that I was engaged in the South Bronx. And one of the beautiful things about Dad is, my father had a third-grade education. My father spoke very limited English, and my father suffered from addictions most of his life. But when I began to organize at home and began to organize in the Bronx, my father found something that was extremely powerful for him. And that was the sense that he could be a part of something bigger than him. And find a sense of power in a world that had taught him that, in essence, he was powerless. My father's job when I was growing up was washing urine off of elevator and stairway walls in the public housing projects where I grew up. This is what I saw my father do every day. And the world that I experienced outside of home taught me that my father was a powerless man. But what he experienced and what I experienced when I saw my father in images like this and in moments like this was something that was much bigger than whatever it was we were fighting for in these images. But it was something that spoke to a legacy of dignity, a legacy of self-determination, a legacy of voice, that regardless of what he would be able to pass on to me as his child, or his grandchildren, he is able to pass this on. And he indeed did. And this is the soul of movement that I think that we need to nurture, that we need to hold up, and that we need to be unafraid to speak up at this moment in our country's history. Thank you. Thank you, Cassie.
So I have a question right out of the box, and that is, your real job is Executive Director of the Access Strategies Fund, and you should explain what that is, but I'm going to give the brief explanation of it, which is, it's a kind of a politically focused organization, and one does not think of politics and soul in the same sentence. So I'm wondering how you now navigate that, negotiate that, and bring that to the work that you do, and if you would explain the work that you do.
Sure. Well, Access Strategies Funds essentially is a family foundation that is funding social movements across the state of Massachusetts. And we fund social movements particularly that are interested in building a new economy, a solidarity economy, building women's public leadership, and building civic engagement. And I would argue that all of those are deeply, deeply sacred work and soulful work. And I understand the reticence and this idea that somehow the two are separate and should be separate. But the argument that I make is that within this work, actually, if you talk to the leaders doing this work, if you talk to executive directors across the state deeply engaged in rebuilding their communities, you will find that for them, the root of this is deeply sacred work. And what my work is now is to figure out how do I nurture and support that through the practices that we engage in as a philanthropy, through the way we make grants, and through the way that we engage with our grantees.
Oh, I have no doubt that the people that you work with think that this is sacred work. I'm talking about the other people you have to work with. I don't think of them as sacred. Sorry, I don't know if anybody thinking about the politicians as sacred. Not me. Or even having a soul, frankly. So I'm just trying to figure out, how you're making it happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's right. I think that's what takes courage in terms of moving this work in this particular direction. I think movement is really clearly speaking to us in this moment and saying, this is who we are, this is what we are about. Movement is deeply engaged in moving moving folks into elected office across the country, moving for greater representation. And so honestly, whether or not the person, the elected official considers this sacred or not is really not the story, not the case. The issue is that folks working, for instance, on issues of budgeting across our state consider things like a budget deeply spiritual and moral documents that talk about and really indicate where our values are and what we care about in this country.
Well, people do say if you look at your checkbook, you can say where your values are on an everyday basis.
Right.
So giving power to the powerless. There are folks in the streets right now, as you've indicated. I'm thinking, of course, notably Black Lives Movement. And boy, the pushback has been intense by many people. Not just because of something that you said, which is, what are they doing? They don't seem to have a hierarchy. Who is the leader? What's happening? I don't get it. All of that. But just in terms of people just being, they almost are offended by the protest. I'm also thinking about, he's not a movement per se, but let's look at Colin Kaepernick. And what he has started now is a movement. If y'all don't know who he is, he's the quarterback in California who just quietly started on bended knee, not while the Star Spangled Banner is being played, and that's now gone around the country, including high school players and others. His point was that he was protesting the violence against unarmed black men in the street. That's his point. It wasn't about the flag. It's really about the protest. Anyway, folks are resentful, and how do you get past that to show people that there is a deeper and a higher purpose, and to your point, which was also the mantra of the civil rights movement, that this is something bigger than ourselves, even if you don't agree.
Yeah. Well, I would name what some of the things you described, that resentment, as essentially fear. I think we fear what we don't understand. I think we fear, in many ways, what appears to be something that will force us to shift the way we see things and the way that we have chosen to live our lives. And I would say that this moment in our country's history really requires us to dig really deep into those places of fear and not shrink in the face of it. And this is what you see with a lot of these movements. But essentially come back in the face of fear and say, yeah, this is a moment where we are going to have to change, where we are going to have to no longer cover up this ugly boil of racism and white supremacy and sexism in this country, which somebody has lanced, whether we want to see it or not, and is now just like running over really ugly in our country. And that we have to say that in order to heal that, we actually have to look at it, face it with, and all the fear that we have, and actually make determinations and come up with ideas of how we might together move forward. Because I think it's clear as a country we don't want to and cannot. There's not this bygone era that we can actually really point to say that this, things were beautiful and perfect and we need to go back there. We've got to figure out a way forward, and that means moving through what is essentially fear.
Curious if people sort of want to turn you off when they hear the faith piece of this, of your conversation. President Obama named you to the Faith Council, the White House Council on Faith and Neighborhoods. And I just wonder if people say, I can do good works without having that piece of it. I can see the need and work with it, but that makes me a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, no, definitely there are people, but I want us to understand that when we use the word faith, whether it's on the council or in my work, that represents a broad swath of practices and rituals. When we talk about faith, when I talk about this work as sacred, I hope you didn't hear religious, because it's not at all what I'm talking about. When I look at you and I know and I see your sacredness as a woman, and when I look at my community and I see the same in young men and black men, and that is really not about religion. Right? And so what we also need to understand is that we may fear this idea of religion or faith, but in many ways we have that in our country, only we call it something else. We call it fundamentalism. It's capitalism. It's this idea of rugged individualism. We worship at the altar of those things all the time anyway. And so I think the invitation, and maybe some of you feel this, of talking about faith and soul in spaces like this actually doesn't really shut us down, but in some way inside invites us to open a little bit.
Last question. Most people talk about this time, you mentioned the music and the art and how distinctive it is, and we should pay attention to what signals that's giving the rest of us and what folks are saying in their own way. Most people call this the age of disconnection. People don't feel connected. The folks who are actually in the streets, who are protesting or even doing the hashtag, are a very small number of folks. How, if your mission, if the soul of the movement is connection, do you make people want to participate at some level? I mean, even now, it's amazing to me that we're getting more conversation about people voting, because a lot of people have said they're not even going to do that. So how do you, understanding from your perspective, it's the soul of the movement is about connection, make connection in a disconnected world?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think part of it is how we choose to intentionally show up in this work. And when I say in this work, for me, that is how I choose to intentionally show up when I show up at my office, very corporate-looking offices in Cambridge in Massachusetts, or how we choose to show up when when I'm meeting with grantees or in our meetings. And I think what we have to think about, what are the things, and these, think about in our own lives, what are the things that foster connection? And so creating space for movement to be able to practice self-care together, to be able to eat a meal together, to be able to start a meeting like this, say for instance, with tell me how you are. Really connect on a human level. This is, this is not religious. This is organizing principle 101. If you look at Alinsky principles of organizing, what does he say? He says the one-on-one is the foundation of organizing. Why? Because in the one-on-one, I hear your story and you hear my story. And you get to connect, we get to connect and name on a gut level what it is that we are feeling and how it is that can motivate us and move us forward with some action together. That's the essence of connection. And I think it's very possible, I think it's very easy, and I don't think it's gonna cost us a ton of money. I think it's really more a shift in culture in the way that we choose to engage with one another in this work.
Okay, thank you. That's Alexie Torres-Fleming, the soul of a movement.